Hey Patreon backers, welcome back to another Patrons Ask GN. For these, you can post your comments in the Patreon Discord. If you don't know how to join it, just do a Google search for Connect Patreon to Discord. Follow those instructions, and that'll get you in there. So we're going to be taking a few questions. It's been a little while. Last time I filmed 2 of these back to back. So I went back up through beginning of June and kind of filtered through some of the questions. I'd like to do some more, but I think we have enough for 2 episodes back to back again right now. And this will just be Patreon only. I might, some of the questions I liked enough that I pulled them to the side for public answering. So my decision making on should this be a public Ask GN or a patrons one basically comes down to, is this something that makes for a catchy headline? Is it something that a lot of people are asking about? Or is it just like a, hey, what's some behind the scenes information or what's some personal help with my system, whatever. Those go to the Patreon section. There are some really interesting ones for this as well. So we'll start out with Wormwood, who posted and said, I haven't been able to find any firm numbers on this from an official source. I was wondering if you knew what the maximum safe liquid temperature was for most AIO units. I figured that Asetek, Coolit, et cetera, might have different specs. Yeah, so the reason I pulled this question to the top is because I actually really know the answer to that one. So this is one we used to talk with a lot of the suppliers for liquid cooling really closely. Our representatives at those places have moved around in the industry, so don't really talk to them as much anymore, but the specs are all the same. So the answer is, it's typically, for Asetek especially, but for most of them, it's about 60 degrees Celsius liquid temperature. And this number, I might address this one in the public episode whenever we do one also, just because there's a lot of misconception about this. People hear 60C and they're like, oh my God, my CPU runs at 60 or 70 all the time, and they start freaking out that their liquid cooler is gonna die. But considering you're asking about liquid temperature, I think you specifically already know about this, but just to really clarify it, 60C liquid is super hot. You can have like a 90, 95 degree K-SKU Intel desktop CPU as an example, and the liquid's probably gonna be under 40 almost certainly, but probably closer to 30. That's with a max pump speed as well on Asetek anyway. So when you're talking about liquid temperature, 60 is pretty hot. That's basically the temperature at which your pump is probably not working, or you're maybe cooling something you really shouldn't be, like a 700 watt CPU overclock with a small liquid cooler. At about 60 degrees Celsius, what typically starts to happen, like with the Asetek units, is you'll get some damage to the plastic internally, and so you're affecting the endurance, the longevity of the cooler. You get more extreme permeation of the liquid into the tubes. The tubes are pretty resilient and resistant to permeation of the liquid, but you go to something like a Cooler Master unit, it's still about 60C, except they have those Teflon-lined tubes. The name, there's a 3-letter acronym that's escaping me right now. Please feel free to post it. But there's a Teflon-lined tube that if you bend it too much, it'll crack the Teflon. So that specifically is much more resilient when it comes to permeation of liquid into the tubes, out of the loop. But it's still about the same temperature where you start seeing potential damage to the internal components of the pump itself. So yeah, that's the answer. It's about 60C, but of course, liquid temperature is much different from actual CPU temperature, so you're probably pretty far from that. Next one is from CheddarBrats, who says, or Brats maybe if you're Deutsch. CheddarBrats says, what torque value do you use when mounting a CPU cooler? Is there a manufacturing spec you follow, or was it something you came up with internally? What are the pros and cons of controlling torque versus normal hand tightening? Would the value change drastically when doing a GPU water block? So most recently I was talking about using specific torques for our dummy heaters. I actually just got done with a bunch of testing. That content will probably be live by the time this is. So that's gonna be our IC diamond versus thermal paste content. And for that one, the way I chose the torque was pretty simple. First of all, I looked into the official Intel spec because we were using an 11.5X socket. So I knew I needed to follow pretty close to that spec. Intel's official spec is public, it's for manufacturing guidance, and their recommendation is about 50 pounds force. So the way they present it, it's not Newton meters, inch pounds, it's not PSI, anything like that, it's just straight pounds. And so companies like Asetek, what they do is they take a 50-pound small brick, like a really dense piece of copper, and they pop it right on top of the pump block, and that's their 50 pounds of force. So it's just, or I guess just 50 pounds rather. So it's just literally 50 pounds on top of the pump block. And that's how they do a lot of the early testing before they start doing mounting kits and stuff like that. So how do we determine what we're using for that testing? Well, it's pretty easy. I mounted an Asetek cooler that I knew I wanted to use for everything. The Asetek coolers do not have springs, at least the ones we're using. So when it doesn't have springs, you're a little bit more free of less control when it comes to fully tightening it. It's a lot easier to go too tight with those and start torquing the bracket. So what I did was I tightened it down to a point where I knew it was making full contact just from mount and remove and check. And from hand tightness, it was about where I knew just from experience that we shouldn't go any tighter with it. Then what I did was I took a screwdriver, torque driver, and I adjusted the torque until I could loosen it and then tighten it back to the same spot, and then that was my torque setting. So it was just trial and error of taking a torque driver and guess and check until I got the number equal to the amount of force. Another thing you can do is get a cooler with springs, and the torque number will change based on the cooler. So some of the really large air coolers do use more mounting pressure, and sometimes they kind of exceed the specification or the guidelines from Intel or AMD, which can be a bad thing, but you get a cooler with springs. And to answer your water block question, a lot of the water blocks, like EKs for CPUs at least, do have springs. And the spring at that point becomes your torque limiter. You're not really going to be able to compress it beyond a certain point. And if you're like dual wielding and using your whole body to turn it, then obviously it's too far. So springs are a great way to just determine the amount of torque that's safe for a unit if it has them. And that's another thing we can guess and check against is, let's take this block with springs, put it on there, tighten it till they stop turning, take the torque driver, adjust it, and then find where it can loosen up and then turn again. So would the value change drastically? It does change cooler to cooler. Most of that comes down to things like, are they using 4 mounting points or 2? Are they using springs or not? And then with water blocks, you start getting into territory where, like with those acrylic ones, you can potentially cause damage. So especially the CPU blocks where, I don't know, there's a little bit more risk there. So for that, we just stick to the springs so if it has them, so that you're not over tightening. Next one is from Necron, who says, would you make a computer running on a bike with the energy of a cyclist? I've seen your side channel and that you love to ride mountain bikes. What if you can bring both worlds together? It's a funny idea. I don't know that I'll ever do it, but I'd have to look at, I need something to measure the amount of power output that you can really generate. I looked it up briefly, and it looks like first result on Google was something like 400 watts over the course of an hour is what's generated from pedaling. I don't know if that was for like a super athlete or a normal person. And then they said peaks of up to 1,000 watts, which I don't really know anything about how the amount of energy humans can create. That sounds high to me, but if it's even close to accurate, 400 watts, or even if you cut it in half, 200 watts, that's enough for like an APU. So it's a funny content idea, and you could potentially power an APU system with it. You'd need something to store and then release the energy, so I guess a battery in there somewhere. Battery connected to just normal power connector. It's a funny idea though, so I guess yes, you could do it, but I don't know how you would do it. Next one, Korgul.jr. says, bit of an illogical question, but interesting. Could you load an OS onto a GPU's memory and run everything on the GPU as an alone system? So I'm not a kernel developer or an OS programmer, but my understanding is that no, I think you would still need the CPU to do all of the basic input-output stuff. You need it to communicate with the GPU and tell it what to do. So I don't know if maybe if it's still in a full system and you're using the CPU to load it into the GPU, is that enough to then? I'm not really sure. My gut tells me that no, you probably can't reasonably do that, but I'm really not sure. I did think it was a fun question to think about, but I'm not really qualified to answer it competently. My guess is that, just based on what I know of how the components communicate with each other, my guess is no. But if someone in the audience knows of an example where that's been done, please link me to it so I can read about it. Rusty says, thoughts on doing a Dune Case Pro review? I think the conversion of a proprietary Apple product to seemingly useful in good cases is interesting. I agree with you. We might do something with that idea, but I don't think it'll be the Dune Pro. We have, from Cramden Institute, when we visited them, we do have one of those Apple cases, so we could potentially convert it for ourselves, but some kind of behind-the-scenes business decision stuff that I mean, typically I just talk about this stuff on the Patreon Ask GN, so it's not all that interesting for the wider audience. But some like business decision making behind the scenes. The Dune Case Pro, one, is a little bit old at this point. It's kind of out of the fad where people really cared about it. And that makes it difficult for us. We can kind of get views on stuff that typically people stop caring about by testing it in a different way. But two, it needs to have enough interest to get something around maybe 100,000 plus views, and that seems really difficult with that case. So I'm not sure that we can really justify that one. Last one, xbit says, hello, quick question on AIO positioning. I see many vertically mounted AIOs with tubing on top. I've seen GN vids stating this is not the best option due to possible air bubbles forming in time. So yeah, you really shouldn't mount with the tubes oriented up on a closed loop liquid cooler. A great example of this in an extreme sense would be bottom mounting it, like on the bottom of a chassis with the tubes up. That's a really bad idea, because what happens is every closed loop has some air in it, just by nature of it. They're not completely airtight. They're not filled to the top with liquid. So there's going to be air in there. You have it bottom mounted as the extreme example. What's going to happen is in the tank, you're going to have the air at the top. It's not like it sits at the bottom, obviously. I mean, everyone knows this. So air's at the top, air's going to get sucked through by the pump. And the water, maybe if there's enough suction, will get pulled through as well, but you're still going to have air going through the tubes and through the pump. And that's going to either cause pump dry out and damage, or in the very least, noise and whine. And so when it comes down to orienting the tubes and like the front of the case, you really want them to be on the bottom if you can. Unfortunately, a lot of manufacturers who make liquid cooling don't seem to understand this, and when they show their case photos with a liquid cooler in it, they have the tubes at the top, so everyone does that. But the reality is, in talking with the engineers of the product and with experience, if the tubes are at the top, as the tank begins to drain over time from permeation of the loop, say over a couple of years, or just stock because maybe it wasn't filled as much as some of the others, the very top part of where the tubes are connecting to the tank, you're gonna have some air get pulled through. That'll make its way into the pump, and it causes that pump whine. It can cause pump burnout, especially if the pump is lubricated by the liquid going through the loop. And so you really want the tubes to be down, because then it guarantees more or less that the only water is going through it, because the air is gonna rise to the top of the tank where there are no tubes, and it won't cause any problems there. It's just gonna sit there. So that's the answer to that one. That's it for this one. We'll do a second one of these as well and upload it spaced out a little bit. So it might be a week later, something like that, but I'm going to take a bunch more questions. And if you post a question after this video and you don't see it answered in the next one, don't be surprised. It's because we've already at that point filmed the second one. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Thanks for supporting us on Patreon. It makes what we do a whole hell of a lot easier. It makes it way easier for me to justify expenses. We just spent a lot on a new piece of test equipment I'll be showing off soon. So a lot of that is thanks to your support. We'll see you all next time.